You say something bad?
Yes, it's really bad. She's bleeding.
Where is she bleeding from?
At their best, Nature Bites Back horror movies show us the might, wonder, and beauty of nature, while also warning us of its dangers. In 2012, Oscar-winning director Barry Levinson wanted to make an eco-documentary about the record levels of pollution in Chesapeake Bay. In the end, he turned this idea into a found-footage creature feature, but with many of the horrors that occur actually semi-based on fact.
We're in the middle of some kind of viral outbreak. It's eating their organs, intestines, liver, it goes for kidneys.
In 2015, French director Lucille Hadzi-Halilovic made a movie about the almost fantastical power of nature, the way natural evolution has allowed certain species to survive and thrive against all odds. But she turned this idea into a Cronenbergian sci-fi body horror. Both films, in very different ways, use eco-horror to show just how small and powerless human beings really are on this planet. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of nature in horror, and we discuss 2012's The Bay and 2015's Evolution. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 10th season, exploring the evolution of nature biting back in horror, and this is part 32. This week, we're looking at two particularly icky, squishy kind of eco-body horror movies, both brilliant in their own very different ways. That's The Bay from 2012 and Evolution from 2015. Now, that's Evolution, the French movie, not the one about aliens starring David Duchovny from the early 2000s. Joining me to discuss these two films, I've got a returning guest. He is here every season, of course, usually to join me in my introduction episode, but what a pleasure to have him back. He is the walking and talking encyclopedia of fantastic film and television. It's the great Kevin Lyons. Hello, Kev.
Hello, Mike. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you? How's your 2025 treating you so far?
Oh, you know, I'm always reminded when people ask me of things like that. I have a great line of dialogue from Cheers when Norm walks into the barn and somebody says, how's life treating you? And he says, like a baby treats its diaper. And,
Exactly.
and I sometimes feel that's pretty much life, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
But not too bad. You know, it's early days yet, but
It's early
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Let's check in again in 6 months maybe and see,
exactly.
see how we're all getting on. Exactly. So it feels like I've been doing this Nature Bites Back series for what feels like years at this point, Kev, because you were here at the beginning of it, and that feels like a long time ago.
You've been doing this since prehistory itself, haven't you?
we have ourselves evolved into other creatures, I think, since this
I wish
started.
that would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But remind us, we talked about this, of course, way back in part one of this series, but just remind us, Kev, what are your thoughts generally on this area, this subgenre of horror? Are you a fan of these types of sort of eco-horror movies, that kind of thing?
Most definitely. You know, so being an old hippie, being a green, being very into the whole sort of, you know, say the ecology thing and all the rest of it, then yeah, these things, even the silly ones, you know, and there are plenty of those, let's be honest, you know, you know, for every serious film, like, you know, the ones we're going to talk about today, there's a grizzly.
Yes.
Or, you know, and they're still fun because they're still, you know, like the chances that I'm going to get killed by a serial killer are very remote, very remote. Yes. I'm never going to encounter a vampire. Probably not a ghost, but the environment's there. Animals are there. Yeah. They're going to, you know, we have to share the planet with them. So,
well,
you know.
Absolutely. And, you know, without getting too bleak, you know, look at even what's happened in the first month of this year. We've had wildfires, we've had floods, we've had, you know, and yet there are still people and politicians who will refuse to believe that this is really happening.
Refuse to believe it. Yeah. I mean, I actually wrote all this down. It was just like this litany of disasters since we spoke.
Yes.
You know, when we last spoke, and that was, about 6 months ago?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So not long in the greater scheme of things. But it feels like, as we're recording this now in the middle of January 2025, Los Angeles is on fire. Wars have devastated not only lives but environments. 2024 is revealed to be the warmest year on record. And just before I came on to record this, I found an article in The Guardian where they're talking about farmland in Britain being contaminated by forever chemicals.
Oh, my God.
Chemicals that can't be got rid of. We're living in the middle of an eco-horror film.
We are.
And it's more relevant and more pertinent today than it was even 6 months ago, I think.
The backlash to it as well. Like, I was reading this thing about how people have tried giving something to do with feeding cows certain chemicals or giving them something that basically is going to make them fart less, essentially.
That's right, yeah.
And which is ultimately going to be good for the planet. And there's backlash about that, saying people are making cows woke and selling me woke milk now. And I was like, we're all doomed, basically, I think,
Do you know what? I now have a rule. And listen to this, okay? If you're going to come on my social media, if you use the word woke and it doesn't mean I'm awake, you're out of there. Unless you can define what you mean by it, and most people can't, and most of us who are against it could probably work out what they mean.
Yes.
By it.
Yes, exactly.
Don't come bothering me with woke unless you've got a definition. It makes me mad.
Honestly, that was it. When I saw people on the right complaining about woke milk in supermarkets, I thought, we are in end times now.
We are, aren't we? Yeah. I mean, we're going to get the fate we deserve, I'm afraid.
Exactly. So there you go. Cheery start to
Cheery start. Happy New Year, everybody.
I know, but I think this is right. Like you said, there's always been this balance in this subgenre of the serious stuff and the really silly stuff. And I think at their best, these movies, I think The Bay does this, which we'll get into, strikes a great balance of that, of these movies that are kind of schlocky monster movies, but maybe they also have a point to them.
But they're very serious schlocky monster movies. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think there's room in this world for both.
Absolutely.
I do like a silly monster on the rampage film. Of course, we all love those. They're great. They're wonderful. But, I do like the ones that sort of show that some people are taking this seriously.
Yes.
Exactly. So I think, we need to get the balance right. And I think they're doing that at the moment.
Absolutely. I agree. And what I love as well, we're going to get into this with these two films particularly, there's a real kind of ickiness and a kind of body horror to certain eco-horror movies, right? Both these movies we're going to talk about, particularly The Bay, really actually gets under my skin as well, right? I suppose quite literally in the case of The Bay. Like there's something, I love it when kind of natural horror veers into this kind of territory as well. This kind of like, oh God, what could be going on inside my body kind of
we're quite lucky as a species that we don't have many parasites.
Right.
That prey on us, whereas, the rest of the natural world has to live with that. Even our cats and dogs will get parasites.
Yes.
We very rarely do. But when we do, my God, do we get them?
Oh, my God.
It's really nasty. And when you think about it, it's like, we're always very keen to say, yes, I live in London, I live in England, I live in Britain, I live in whatever. We don't. We live in our bodies.
Yes.
That's all we've got. We live inside these very fragile, very unreliable containers, which will eventually break down. Oh, we're being so positive, aren't we, at the moment? But a little ray of sunshine that I am. But they'll break down eventually.
Yep.
They'll break down and stop working. We call that death. That's part of life. We live with it. That's cool. That's what happens. And I think that's where these films hit hardest, is when they expose how vulnerable the container we live in.
Right.
That contains us.
Yeah.
I mean, us is our collective memories, our personality and all the rest of it. All of that's contained in this little container, which is pretty fragile. Anything could happen to us. So we're always on the lookout. We're always on the lookout for, what could happen. And that's why I think we love body horror and Nature Bites Back films.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and we probably talked about this in our introduction chat, horror filmmakers and storytellers have created creatures, whether it's the xenomorph or whatever, these unspeakable parasitic creatures, when actually they exist in our natural world anyway, right? Like some of the things that live under the ocean or whatever are the stuff of nightmares, right? When you read about what certain parasites and animals do to each other, Well,
the alien in Alien, the xenomorph, was actually inspired by real actual animals. There was a wasp, if I seem to remember properly, that sort of burrowed into people's heads and built a nest in your head.
Yeah.
And so then it would burst open, just like the chest burster did. We like to sort of maintain this illusion that we're top of the food chain.
Yeah.
And we are in our civilised world. The minute you step outside our civilised world, or God help you, go underwater, you're no longer top of the food chain.
Yeah.
You're just, another organism that's, got to fight for survival. We're not used to doing that now because we've got this sort of veneer of civilization around us.
Yeah. And I think it's particularly the world of the aquatic world, right? We've talked about a lot of shark movies this series, and both these films we're about to talk about very much set in these kind of like seaside places, right? This idea of living right on the cusp of this entire other world, really, right? Like being underwater is like being in space.
It is. I mean, I lived for many years in coastal towns, and it has got that kind of thing that you're constantly aware that the sea is just over there.
Yeah.
And even though, it was the English Channel or the Solent that I lived nearby, we're kind of, a bit blasé about it. We don't really know what's down there.
No.
Waiting to come up and grab us, it's very scary. And I think because we're so uniquely not qualified to be underwater.
Yes.
There's nothing about being underwater that it makes us safe and comfortable.
No, we can't really. It's a place that we can't really conquer, to be honest, can we?
We can't, and we shouldn't even try,
Yeah.
to be honest. So let's leave one part of this planet where we haven't tried to conquer it. There are egomaniacs out there who think they can. Just don't. Just leave.
James Cameron, he loves going down under the ocean.
I wasn't going to mention him, but now that his name's cropped up, James, please just make films. Just leave the water alone. Just make films.
Yeah, it's so true. But you're right. I grew up in a seaside town as well, and that feeling of even when things you take a walk down the beach and there'll be certain things that have washed up on the beach, and you go, what is that?
Yeah.
Is that alive? Is that a bit of seaweed? Is that a creature? I don't know what that is.
Things you don't want to go over and prod even with a stick because you're not quite sure what it's going to do. Yeah, no, that happens even around so the relatively safe coastline of Britain. Guys listening to this abroad, you'll have all sorts of unique horrors and terrors awaiting you in your sea. But I am so cheerful today. I don't know what's got into me.
I love it. I think it's good. I think it's a good introduction before we get into this week's movies. So let's get into it, shall we? We're going to begin by talking about The Bay from 2012.
Good morning, Maryland. I am in Claridge, the host of our annual July 4th party.
Oh my God!
This is the CDC.
We're in the middle of some kind of viral outbreak. It's eating their organs, intestines, liver, it goes for kidneys.
There's something wrong with the water.
This stuff has chemical steroid in it.
Hey, we got a situation over the 911 call center, and the system's about to go down. We're just overloaded with calls.
Stephanie, you're not answering your phone. I do not want you to get off that boat.
I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. I know they shut down all the roads going into Claridge. Now I'm flying over the water here, and, there's just dead fish everywhere.
That's so big, I don't think he fits in this boat. You ever seen anything like that?
Never seen nothing like that. What is it?
Son of a bitch!
Kev, set us up. Give us a little brief plot synopsis of The Bay.
It's a subset of found footage where it's actually a fake documentary.
Yes.
It's not, some people running around the woods with a camera. This has been structured. This has been edited. And it tells the story of Chesapeake Bay, which is a real place which suffers very much most of the real problems we see in this film. They haven't got these, some monsters and stuff, but it's about Chesapeake Bay. It's the 4th of July.
Yeah.
There are lots of Jaws connections here. 4th of July, seaside town, you've got a mayor that doesn't want to listen and wants to carry on. So there's a lot of Jaws references, but it's very much its own film.
Yeah.
It's the 4th of July. As a trainee TV reporter, Donna Thompson was on the scene making a news broadcast when there's an outbreak of something in this small town. Something really quite horrible. People are dying, they're disappearing. The ones we do see are covered in the most horrific sores and rashes. Really horrible. And it all turns out to be a highly aggressive species of, and forgive me if I don't get this right, Cymathoa exigua.
Oh, good.
Isopods.
Yeah.
Isopods. It's an parasitic louse-like creature that is developed in the highly polluted waters of Chesapeake Bay,
Yeah.
and has now found something new to prey on. It's been preying on the fish for a long time, and now they've found, actually, they eat organs. They eat you from the inside out, which is horrific. And they've been doing that to fish, and now they found, actually, these humans that keep waddling about in the water, they taste even better. We're going to go and get them.
God.
And it's just, basically, it's one day in the life of this town as seen through the eyes of Donna and her cameraman, and various other things like police cameras and so on. And it's just this horrible build-up of, like, things start very slowly. You know, one or two people not being well, and then suddenly, before you know it, the whole hospital is overrun. There are bodies on the streets. It's really scary stuff. It really is amazing.
Yeah, so you're a fan of this film, aren't you, Kev? Tell me what you think about
film.
it. Yeah.
I love this film. I do. You know, found footage, I have a bit of a sort of mixed relationship, as I think a lot of us do with found footage. When they get it right, you know, and I'm thinking about things like Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity and Cloverfield and things like that, they're great.
Yeah.
It's a very legitimate form of storytelling, I think. Unfortunately, there's so much of it which just is people running around the woods with a video camera, and you've got like 5 minutes of action at the end of the film and 70 minutes of people running around shouting at each other. Yeah. And those I can do without. This is a brilliant example of how to do it. This is taking this found footage, assembling it into the... I often wonder when I'm looking at found footage films, who's presenting this to me?
Right, that's what's fascinating,
Yeah, who's created this? You know, we know who's created the footage, but who's created the manifestation of it that we're watching? And this gives sort of a context to that.
Yeah.
You know, it's a documentary that's been put together by Donna and by some people we never see. We hear their voices talking to her over the camera. She's clearly on the run. She's terrified because they've had, you know, the whole thing has been covered up. Yeah. And these people want to expose what's going on. So you've got this structured thing showing the full horror of what happened in this town in 24 hours.
It's perfect. It's a perfect kind of setup, isn't it? And reason for the format too. Because you're so right about that. I've just started a found footage mini-series over on Patreon, actually. And I was talking to my guest about this. It's a really interesting thing, this idea of, even with the Blair Witch, we are watching what is supposed to be found footage.
Sure.
But it's been edited, right? Even within the world of the film, we're watching cutaways. We're watching the black and white footage while we hear Heather talk. And it's like, in the world of this, who has edited this together and why? This? You know, and that's interesting.
Even something like Cloverfield, which, you know, we can assume has been edited by the military.
Yes.
Why are the military interested in all the dicking about at the start? Just cut to the monster
the love
attack.
triangle at the party and stuff.
No one's interested in that in the military. They just want to get to the monster stuff. And, you know, it's still a great film. It still works. But at the back of your mind, you've always got that question, why are we seeing this?
Yes.
Why is this being presented to us? I think the Bay gets around that to a large extent.
It does. I think you're right, because it's supposed to be a documentary, and in a way, documentaries are supposed to tell stories. And
of course.
It is this whole thing of this footage has been sort of suppressed, right? It's been hidden, and removed by the government, and now we're showing
gathered
you
it all
what's
together.
been hidden. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so, even the bits at the beginning where we first meet Donna and she's sort of, you know, getting ready to go on camera, it all still counts.
Yes.
Because we need to know who Donna is.
Absolutely.
To make the rest of it work. And so, in some ways, I'll stick my head on the block and say it may be the perfect found footage film in that sense. You know, I think it is so well done. But then, you know, look who directed it.
Oh, my God. I mean, let's talk about this, because this is an unusual person to have directed a small found footage monster movie, right? Barry Levinson, Oscar-winning director of films like Rain Man, right? Insane.
Yeah, Diner, The Natural, Young Sherlock Holmes, Good Morning Vietnam, horror films, every one of them. You know, and it came about because he wanted to make a documentary about Chesapeake Bay.
Right, that's
for those who don't know, go and read up on Chesapeake Bay. It will keep you awake at nights. In the 1970s, it was one of the first areas to be declared a marine dead zone.
Yeah.
Where there was just no oxygen in parts of the water at all because of all this runoff of silage from chicken factories, which of course is what happens in the film.
Right.
And it's, you know, the huge chunks of the bay are dead. In the late 1990s, loads of fish were found floating, and swimmers got nasty rashes when they got out of the water.
Yeah.
Sound familiar?
Wow.
Yeah. And, this has happened a lot. There's whole sort of species of like lobsters and crabs and so. They found crabs coming ashore to get oxygen.
Oh, wow.
Because the water is so dead.
Oh my
and,
God.
This runoff creates what they call algal blooms, where massive amounts of algae suddenly appear. I never know how to pronounce that word. It suddenly appears and it cuts off the sunlight and chokes the fish to death. This is really happening in Chesapeake Bay. They're getting better. Slow progress is being made. But even at the time that the bay was made, it was a complete disaster area.
Right.
And Levinson wanted to make this documentary about it. And then he found out that the TV series Frontline were going to be doing their own special report on it. And so he thought, well, I want people to know about this. I'll make a horror film. People watch horror films. I'll make a horror film. So he got these writers to come along. His writer had written a short story about a group of people who enter a small coastal town and find that it's dead, that everybody's gone. So he adapted that into this format. Levinson said, can we make it look like a documentary? And, of course, yeah. And so we've got this highly unusual film from a man not really known for this sort of thing.
Yeah. It's so clever. That's really clever, isn't it? And this whole idea, again, I've spoken about this a lot with regards to found footage, this relationship between sort of truth and artifice, I suppose, is really interesting here. Like you say, it's not set in a fictional, Amity Island type place, right? It's very much, okay, so this is a real place where this is a real danger.
The town is fictional, but the bay is real.
And now we're just going to push it. We're just going to turn it up a little bit more, right? And that's really interesting.
It's like all the best science fiction, and I think this is as much a science fiction film as a horror film.
Yeah.
The best science fiction takes a look at what's going on around us and says, what if?
Yes.
And then extrapolates that out into something, that can be a bit absurd sometimes, but then turns out to be true and so on. And that's what he's doing here. He was looking at Chesapeake Bay and thought, what would it be like if? And he later said that it's about 80% factual, what we're seeing in the bay, which is, if you weren't scared enough by this film, 80% of what you're seeing is factual. It's basically the isopods that are made up.
Yeah.
They're not real. They haven't found those. Virtually everything else is absolutely documented, and so it's real. It's happening in this poor bay that's been devastated by idiot humans.
That is genuinely terrifying, isn't it?
It is.
And I don't think I knew that when I first watched it. I watched this way back in, I think, 2012 when it first came out. Had no idea about Chesapeake Bay's history, to be honest. And that
Go
it was
and read up on Chesapeake Bay, then watch this film again. Because I was the same. I didn't know anything about it when I first saw it. And it was when I was reading up other people's thoughts on the film afterwards, I tend to do, and people mentioned the real-life Chesapeake Bay, and I went and had a read about it, and it was like, oh, my God, and I went back and watched the film again, and this time I didn't sleep for a week,
Horrible.
Really awful.
Really interesting. I love that it's done like a documentary, and it is in itself kind of semi-factual, right?
Semi-factual, yeah. It's an example of a filmmaker trying to terrify us and educate us at the same time, and I think, he does both extremely well.
He does. It's like Threads, but with monsters,
It is,
basically.
yeah, Threads with monsters. Threads was an educational film, probably the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life.
Absolutely,
it's like,
absolutely.
I watched that again recently when BBC 4 showed it and spent another tearful night. Because, it's like...
You end up in therapy after watching it, basically.
Exactly,
yes.
Absolutely horrifying.
But I think this has a similar vibe. I love this horror movie, and it really, like I said, it gets, no pun intended, it gets under my skin. I find it very icky, very squirmy. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's that thought, isn't it? There's something that it's not being malicious, the isopods. They just don't care about us. We're food. We're just food. We're just the larder, basically. And they're treating us the way, and I'm going to put my vegetarian's hat on here, the way we treat, cows and sheep and everything else. We just treat them as food.
Yeah.
And that's what the isopods see us as. They don't see us as any threat. We're not a threat to them. We're not a benefit to them. We're just food.
Yeah.
And they don't care. You can't reason with them. You can't say, look here, Mr. Isopod, please don't eat my liver.
Yeah.
It's going to eat you anyway, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And I think that's what makes it so icky.
Yes.
That they're going to get inside you, and once there is... The horrific bit of business, isn't there, where there's a young couple with a baby, which is always,
God.
sort of like, oh my God, what's going to happen to the baby?
Mm-hmm.
And the guy jumps into the bay for a swim. Oh. And if you listen to him, he actually said it's quite hard to hear at first. He said, I've got it in my mouth. Because he's got water in his mouth. And you immediately, because you know what's going on already, you're like, oh, no. And it takes, I think they said 8 hours for him to get the water into his mouth and then an isopod to tunnel out the side of his neck.
Oh, my God.
That's all it took was 8 hours, and it's just this relentlessness of them.
Yes.
Awful.
Yes. That feeling of just infection too. It's an infection movie as well, above everything else, isn't it?
Definitely.
And like 28 Days Later or whatever, this idea of kind of like, if you get some fluid in your mouth, you're done for, essentially.
You're done for, exactly.
And, that is horrible. I wonder if even more so these days, watching it 10 years on post-COVID, it even adds something to it, I think.
It does. And of course, in Britain, we've had lots of talk of the state of our water supplies.
Yes.
With the amount of sewage that's been dumped in both rivers and in actually drinking water areas. I mean, somewhere in South London, not that far from me, really, they found an outbreak of I can't remember what it's called, but it was very, very nasty stomach bacteria.
Yeah.
That can be fatal in some people. And I've got to admit to you, I stopped drinking water out of the tap a long time ago. I'm now very, very worried about even brushing my teeth in tap water. I use bottled water because I don't know what's in there anymore. I'm not normally paranoid about these things, but when you see the evidence that's been presented.
Yeah.
So we've got... and just like in COVID as well, in the Bay, we've got these fairly ineffectual authorities who have no idea how to deal with this situation. Even the CDC, the Centres for Disease Control, it's their job. It's what they do every day. They still don't quite know how to deal with this outbreak.
Right. Yeah,
because it's not like anything they've seen before. And so, although it was made before COVID, there is still chilling, sort of like a prescient feel to it.
Yeah.
This is what we went through. We lived through. We didn't have isopods, but we did have something even smaller that was killing a huge number of people.
Absolutely, and that terrifying idea. And we spoke about we spoke about this, Kev, before it happened. But we talked about how we were almost due a pandemic, right? And we were not the world wasn't ready for it. The authorities weren't ready for it. And that idea of like, actually, when nature wants to come and get us, we are never prepared for it, are we? That's the thing, Well,
thanks for that, Muncer. We've already done it once. We're going to do it again, aren't we? But you're absolutely right. We later learned that the government had sort of done like an exercise to deal with an outbreak and then didn't act on it. So we should have been ready for it, and we weren't. I suspect... I'm going to be very careful what I say here after the last time, but I suspect that when the next one comes, because it is a question of when, not if, when the next one comes, I suspect because we're human beings, we won't learn a bloody thing.
No.
We'll just carry on blithering about as we normally do. Then we'll get another pandemic and we'll be back in lockdown again. And, it's just, we don't learn anything. We really don't learn anything as a species. We're hopeless like that. But,
yeah. And I think that is one of the scary things about the Bay, isn't it? This idea of kind of this panic, I suppose, that sets in. You get this panic, the authorities, the medical staff, the hospitals, no one really understands what's happening and no one knows what to do about it.
I really feel for the doctors in the film, in the hospital. The hospital scenes are some of the most upsetting in the whole film. But I really feel for them because they're trying to deal with something that they've never been trained to deal with. Mm-hmm. Maybe on paper they've sort of sat in a module at medical school about infectious diseases. They've never encountered one.
Yeah.
And now suddenly they're encountering something the likes of which even the medical books probably couldn't have imagined.
Right.
So you kind of really feel the sense of hopelessness and panic, and the sort of, the devotion of these guys. One of the doctors that we see the most in the thing stays behind in the hospital and gets infected because he wants to be there to the bitter end trying to save people, So, it's very upsetting, those moments. It really is,
Yeah. How do you find it's quite a big, it's almost a kind of ensemble piece,
it is,
isn't it? Because we're getting so much footage from different people around the town.
Yeah.
How do you find that? Does that affect the movie for you in any way in terms of the storytelling and giving us a sense of character or anything like that?
Not really, because I think the character of the Bay is the story.
Yeah.
I think that's, it's important. We do get some characters that stand out. Obviously, Donna is the core of it all. We see her on the day, and, she's very funny. She's really, really well played by Ketha Donahue, who
she's
an
great.
actress I'm not particularly aware of, really, apart from this film. I hope she's done lots more, because she's very good in this. And there's lovely little bits like, she's... When you see her in the now footage,
yes,
when she's on Zoom, it's very clear that she's been very badly damaged.
Right.
That's a person suffering from PTSD.
Right.
And she conveys that very subtly with just the movement of her eyes and the sort of body language and so on. But there are also little moments, like when she first sees herself in the footage, because she's kind of giving this little commentary as well in parts of it.
Yeah.
And it's very funny. She said, why didn't anybody tell me my trousers were too tight?
Yeah,
and it's little bits of humour that we can't... It doesn't matter how awful everything is, we still have our sense of humour, and she's retained that despite everything. But there are some characters who are very memorable. Like I say, the Doctor.
Yes.
He's heartbreaking, that Doctor,
And the mayor, there's always the kind of the corrupt mayor.
Venal mayor, who's just like, no, we're going to carry on as we are. Best glass of water I've ever tasted. Yeah, you bloody idiot. And that, that sort of harks back to it. I don't know whether Levinson was aware of this, but during the Mad Cow... Well, did the Mad Cow? It's one of those. One of our politicians actually ate something.
That's
that was
right.
And it's like... It's that kind of grandstanding, performative nonsense that politicians do.
Absolute nonsense,
because they're terrified of losing.
I think he gave it to his kids as well.
Gave it to his kids, yeah, that's right.
The Agriculture Minister, John Gummer, today enrolled his daughter, Cordelia, in his campaign to persuade people that eating beef is safe. It was a little hot for her.
It's too hot!
But later he munched it himself to prove to the world that he at least is confident there's nothing to worry about.
There is no need for people to be worried, and I can say perfectly honestly that I shall go on eating beef as my children will go on eating beef, because there is no need to be worried. Now, you can't do anything more than that.
But yeah, so it harks back to that, and I don't know whether Levinson was aware of that. I suspect he's quite a cultured man who keeps up to date with things. Maybe he did remember that. But yeah, you got him, and particularly I like the couple with the baby.
Yeah.
They become the sort of dominant characters in the last half of the film. They're out on a boat. They've gone out into the bay for a boating holiday, and they get a phone call from, I think it's her mum, isn't it, saying, come back to shore quickly. Nasty things are going on. And by the time they've got back, virtually the whole town has been wiped out.
Right.
And it's just the two of them and this baby and a few people they encounter. And we get a fabulous shock moment, jump scare, with her in a car, with mum in a car. Oh, terrifying. But, because it's, yes, it's manipulative, but it's done so well. Because it's a baby.
Yeah.
We're seeing what these things are doing to adults,
right?
And we're hoping and praying we're not going to have to watch a baby go through that, because that would be a step way too far,
Yeah, so, I know, and that's it. And the best horror movies are the ones that ride that line, and they don't always cross the line.
No,
right? But even knowing that there is a baby in peril in this,
of course,
is horrible.
It's horrible, absolutely horrible. Because we're defenceless against these isopods. A baby is defenceless against everything,
right?
So it's kind of so I really like those two as characters. Yeah. It's very nice to see a married couple in a horror film who aren't bickering.
It's true, actually, isn't it? Yeah, just like a normal, happy family. Yeah.
She gets annoyed with him because he keeps threatening to throw her in the water and things like that. But that's married life, isn't it?
Exactly.
Men are dickheads and women learn to live with it.
It's so true. How do you find the horror itself then? Because again, there are jump scares in this, and there is, proper classic horror in that regard, isn't there?
Oh, definitely. I watched it again last night. Any old excuse, frankly, to watch it again. And every single time I manage to forget this one little moment that freaks me out. It's some footage they found from a camera of some people out fishing on a boat. And they hook a fish and bring it in, and you can hear them saying, what's that? What's that in its mouth? And they hook the mouth out. And this thing runs out of the mouth and crawls up the guy's arm. And, really jump when that happens.
Horrible, yeah.
Horrible, isn't it? Yeah. And that's
really
our first sight of the sort of bigger isopods. You know, we've seen small, tiny little... What harm are they going to do us once inside the fish? But this is the first time we've seen just what they're going to turn into.
Exactly.
Yes. Really horrible.
I agree. I think the horror is so effective and it builds, right? I think the pacing of this film is great. The way that the story is told with that first sort of few minutes of just seeing people around the town happy and getting a sense of place, right? And then the way that the chaos of the horror slowly escalates and escalates, right?
You get one victim, don't you? That woman walking down the road that's covered in the sores, and then literally in the blink of an eye, we cut to the hospital and there are hundreds of them. It spreads that quickly.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just like, why did it not happen before? Well, you know, why did COVID not happen before? These things just come out of nowhere. Yeah. And, you know, these isopods have been in the water for a very long time. They've just found out that humans are a good host.
Yeah.
And it's the 4th of July. There's a lot of people splashing about in the water. There's lots of ways to get into them.
Yeah.
And once they're into them, they consume their organs. They break out of the body. They can then get into another body.
Right.
They're very like, in some ways, the parasites in Shivers.
I was thinking Shivers.
Film.
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of Cronenberg in this movie, generally, isn't there?
Whenever you're talking about body horror, there's going to be some Cronenberg. Of course there is. He's ground zero for all this stuff.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you know, the fact that you've got these invasive parasites that will burst out of your body and then scuttle into somebody else's body if they can get to them, you know, that immediately when I first saw it, I thought, oh, yeah, you know, Barry, mate, you made all these great sort of mainstream films, but you've been watching David Cronenberg as well, haven't you? You're a
Definitely.
Cronenberg fan.
And just like with Cronenberg as well, there is this kind of, there's a scientific, almost realism to it, right? You mentioned this film is just as much a sci-fi as it is a horror. I think the movie cleverly spends a lot of time kind of explaining the isopods, the science, the parasites, right? They give it a feeling of authenticity, don't they, I think?
And it's never boring.
No.
Never feel like you're being lectured at. In fact, we learn most of it from the somewhat ineffectual CDC scientists.
Right,
who are trying to piece together what's happening. They actually don't know what's been going on because they're not there. They're not at Chesapeake Bay. They don't actually know what's going on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they tell each other things about these creatures and, you know, the history of them and where they've been found in the world. But it's fascinating. It's done in such a way that we're not feeling like we're being lectured at all. It's still an intrinsic part of the story. And, it's very well thought out. It's very well put together.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a single moment in it that pulls me out of it. A lot of times when you get these things, you get pulled out of it. You know, found footage, invariably, you have somebody with a camera and then suddenly towards the end when it's getting all excited, we'll get a different camera angle.
Yeah.
And you hang on a minute, where have they just come from? You get, because of the structure of this one, you can get away with that. You can get away with cutting camera work. And the science appears to work.
Yes.
You know, I'm no expert in this area at all, but to me, as a non-expert, it seems to work. I believe it.
Yeah.
I'll buy it. I think most people do.
Definitely. And because, like you say, this real place of Chesapeake Bay and this real pollution and these real issues, these real dangers, it's just like one step removed almost, isn't it?
It is. And again, that's the best science fiction. It's things that are happening 5 minutes time.
Right.
You know, they sort of, it's not, you know, you get all your Star Wars and your Flash Gordons and all the rest of it, and they could be fun, you know, big space operas and stuff, but it's the ones where people look at what's going on around you and just think, how can we make this even scarier?
And the body horror is horrible. And I'm not even talking about the most extreme stuff, but just like the rashes that people get and the kind of the sores and that kind of thing.
The makeup effects are stunning. I mean, they're just... these horrible boils all up and down their arms and legs, and they're kind of festering, and you can see that some of them are popped.
Right,
and they're kind of oozing, and it's like, apologies if anybody's eating, but honestly, it's horrible. And that's the word I keep using, isn't it? It's horrible. The film is horrible, but genius with it.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's not a film for the faint-hearted, I don't think.
No.
I wonder how many people went to watch it because it was Barry Levinson.
Oh, my God, that's hilarious.
And thought, we're going to get Good Morning Vietnam too.
Yeah.
You know, this is great. The Bay, it sounds so nice and cosy, doesn't it? And then you get this. I reckon a lot of people were very traumatized by seeing this.
I agree. And I think because it's paced so well and it's directed so well that, what begins as those kind of rashes and boils then becomes, isopods crawling out of people's necks.
Yes.
You kind of believe, by the time you get to that point, you sort of believe it, right? You're in it.
Oh, you don't question for 1 minute, like how does a rash of boils on your arm become an isopod in your body? You don't.
Yeah.
You just assume that these boils are a symptom of having this thing inside you.
Yeah.
And you never question it because you're far too busy panicking at that point. By the time we get to that, you're far too busy thinking, oh my God, this is awful. Oh no.
Exactly.
So you're not really sort of thinking straight anyway.
And what do you think of the creature design then of these isopods? Again, less phallic than a lot of David Cronenberg's parasites, maybe,
But they're sort of no less disturbing for all that. They look like a sort of an aquatic woodlouse.
Yes, that's it. Exactly.
And I don't think I've certainly never met anybody, I don't think I want to meet anybody that would find a woodlouse cuddly and cute.
Oh, horrible.
They're horrible things, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, they're not, I can remember once I used to eat pomegranates till they were coming out my ears. My mum used to go to the market every Saturday, bring me back a big bag of pomegranates. I got one out one day and there was a woodlouse running around inside. Never eaten a pomegranate to this day. And I loved them, but it was just, that's horrible. And they're not sort of scary particularly because they can't hurt you, but they just look repulsive.
Exactly.
And so you put them underwater where they become like a cross between a louse and a crustacean.
Yeah.
And then it burrows into your body. So you've got a woodlouse inside you. I mean, no wonder we feel a bit queasy.
God. Yeah.
Watching this film, and it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't pull any punches when it comes to representing what that does to you.
Exactly.
It's really, really unsettling.
Oh, it's horrible. And I think, you're right. That kind of, we talked about this a lot together. We talked about it with the aliens and stuff, that it looks enough like real creatures that we recognize.
That's right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
it's not some horribly weird, wacky thing that's yellow and purple and got 16 legs and an antenna. It looks like something that could exist.
Exactly.
In our environment.
This kind of, it's like a crustacean, isn't it? Like
That's
this
right.
thing with a kind of hard shell, but it's also a bit gooey and a bit.
And it's amphibious as well.
Yes, exactly.
Which is even worse because it can come out from the place we shouldn't be into the place we should be and still get us.
Oh God. And there are a few questions around what has caused this, right? Because there is the issue of pollution of kind of chicken shit, basically, right, in the water.
Yeah.
There's maybe people testing like radioactive kind of stuff.
There's
right?
talk, isn't there, of a minor, I don't know how they work this out, a minor radioactive leak in the area.
Right, exactly.
Minor radioactive?
Yeah.
Minor? Really? The default setting for radioactive leak is none.
Right, exactly.
Okay, you don't. There's none, and there's run like hell. There's nothing else in between, as far as I'm concerned. If someone announced today, here I am in King's Cross, and there's been a minor radioactive release, I'm heading to Scotland.
Yes,
It's just if I can get further than that, I would try. But there is this sort of very flippant throwaway line about a minor radiation leak, and it's kind of. They never really get to the bottom of what's causing it, although it definitely seems to be mostly around this sort of the runoff from the chicken farms. We get there's found footage from an activist, eco-activist, who breaks into the chicken coop.
Right.
And they're talking about the desalination plants. And this is quite a chilling moment as well. It's very subtle, but they talk about the desalination plant has been watering the chickens.
Yeah.
And we see this horrible footage of battery hens, which is just...
Oh, God, it's horrible.
Always upsetting and really nasty. And then we learn towards the end that the desalination plant might not have been enough to stop the larvae from getting through.
Yeah.
It had defences against larger organisms to stop fish getting through.
Yeah.
But there wasn't enough safeguards to stop very small parasites getting through. So not only is there drinking water infected by this runoff, and it sounds horribly familiar in Britain 2025, doesn't it? There's this runoff of pollution has infected their water. It's also in their chickens, which are being shipped around the country.
This is it.
And it's very subtle. That's not emphasised in the film, but it's there. It's very unsettling again.
And it is, to link it back to real world, unsettling for those of us that, because I am a meat eater, but there is always this idea of, like, I do always have this thought of, like, I'm just buying some chicken breasts from some supermarket, and okay, it says it's free range, it says it's organic, but actually you have no idea really what you're eating and putting in your body a lot of the time. They
could be saying whatever they want you to hear. And I'm not suggesting they are for 1 minute, but, we don't know that. We take a lot on trust. I say we, I'm vegetarian.
Are you a lifelong veggie, Kev? Have you?
Well, since I was 14 and I'm 62 now.
Yeah,
so a good chunk of my life I've been vegetarian.
Yeah.
And there are moments, especially when I'm watching the Bay, when I'm sitting back very smug, thinking, "Ha I made a right life choice for once."
Absolutely,
But no, I mean, if this stuff gets into the food chain, like we were talking about mad cow disease.
Yeah.
I can well remember that panic and the sense of smugness that I had at the time, but I can remember the panic that it was causing. Should we be trusting? And, the more recent one about finding horse meat.
Oh, yeah, of course.
In lasagnas and stuff. It's like every so often we seem to get these panics about what we're eating.
Yeah.
And, vegetarians were not entirely free of it because we don't really know what's been sprayed onto the plants either.
That's true. Yeah. Your fruit and veg, again, is like, unless you're growing it yourself, you just don't know, do you?
And when you live on the 5th floor of an inner city apartment block, you're very limited in what you can grow. I can't have an orchard on my balcony, sadly. I'd love to, but I can't. But so it does plug into these very real fears, I think, that we don't really know because it's all... There was a time... even older than me, when people farmed and grew their own food.
Yeah.
That was how people lived. They sort of, grew the corn and the wheat and whatever and just, made everything themselves. As we became more and more industrialised and we had all this food being made for us, it becomes ever more of an issue. What am I eating?
Yeah.
Am I eating a chicken from Chesapeake Bay? Mm-hmm. Certainly if I was in America and I'd seen the Bay, I would have very severe thoughts about ever eating a chicken again.
Totally, exactly, yeah. So I think you're right. It plays into those sort of very real fears and anxieties. And then, of course, the one that is so much a big fear and anxiety in the world, I feel like, again, in 2025, it's that the people in power are lying to us, right? Or that they are covering it up, or that the truth has been repressed or suppressed in some way.
Worse still, they're incompetent.
Yes.
And then they're covering up their incompetence.
Exactly.
And that's what makes it worse. That they are, in this film, they're absolutely useless. Mm-hmm. Reports were filed about there's a pair of oceanographers who were the first victims of the isopods. And a report was filed and it was sent to the CDC and no one read it.
Yeah.
And you just, again, you look back at the COVID thing and you think, looking back, and it's so easy with the benefit of hindsight to look back at these things, but you think they had so many warnings that this was coming. That chap Kevin Lyons said something about it with Mike Muncer on his podcast one time. They were warned that something was coming. They knew that there was this outbreak in China and did nothing about it until suddenly the country is locked down and people are dying left, right, and centre. And so it's. Like I said earlier, very prescient in that respect. But I think this is just true of all natural disasters.
Yeah.
I just don't think the authorities ever plan ahead enough.
No.
For any of them.
No, it's and of course that is the nub at the end of this whole movie, isn't it? And the fact that we're watching the footage that we're watching is because this footage had been kind of hidden or removed,
been suppressed.
Exactly.
And they paid people off, and Donna, bless her, refused to be bought off, and had made contact with this group of people who we don't really know who they are, but are kind of assuming they're eco activists who've got some way of getting this footage out to people. But so it at the end it's very dispiriting, having been through the whole thing, to hear us saying the money changed hands and it's been suppressed and all the footage was rounded up, and and you kind of get the impression that you sat through an hour and a half or whatever it is of this film and it's only scratching the surface. This is just the footage they could find. There was probably much more going on.
And like you say, that only gave us like a day, a 24-hour period as well. Like, what happened after that,
Did anybody get out of the town? They talk about cutting off the bridge and it stayed cut off for 3 days with people dying on this bridge because they couldn't get back into town. Did someone get away? Did someone get on a boat and go somewhere and take these isopods with them and then infect somewhere else? It's kind of, there's almost like a feeling at the end of George Romero's The Crazies.
Yes.
where they've contained it. Oh, no, we haven't.
Right.
It's got out.
That's
it's escaped.
it. That's it.
And, you know, although they don't say that in the Bay, you can't help but wonder, because we've seen The Crazies and so many films like it, it's kind of an unstated truth almost that, yeah, you think you've contained this.
Yeah.
But we know how useless you are.
Right.
Very good chance this has escaped and got away.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it does. It doesn't give you everything tied up neatly in a bow, does it, by the end?
It doesn't. No, quite right too. I like a film that doesn't... I like a film that makes you think about what might be at the end of a film.
Yeah.
You know, I do enjoy... I like people riding off into the sunset as much as the next person, but I do like the films that just sort of like... You know, I like those, the end, question mark.
Yeah.
Those kind of films, you know, is it really the end? Because it makes you then think, where has this thing gone and is it coming for me?
Yeah. That lovely end to the original Halloween where Michael Myers is just missing.
Yes,
right? You know,
that's right. Like... which is just a terrific ending. It couldn't have ended any other way.
Yeah.
If it ended with him dead, it would have been too predictable.
Yeah.
If he'd been captured and taken back to hospital, too predictable. He had to have just gone, and he's still out there.
Yeah.
And it's still Halloween night, you know? It's like,
exactly. And so, you're left with that slight uneasy feeling of like, still wouldn't go back to Chesapeake Bay and swim in the water there.
Honestly, I'm not one for swimming. I can't swim. I'm terrified of water. But I wouldn't, to be honest, if I went to America at any point, I would steer well clear of Chesapeake Bay just to be on the safe side. I'm sure the people there are absolutely lovely. And if you live near there, I apologise, but I'm not coming. No way are you getting me even close to that place. It's a scary place.
Yeah, and you get some shots at the end, don't you, of just people swimming in the bay again and everything. But you get that feeling of like, okay, it's going to happen again. You know,
we don't learn.
Yeah.
We don't learn.
Yeah.
We are absolute idiots. The minute COVID was over, everyone was down the pub breathing things on each other, and it's still here. COVID's still here. It's still affecting people. You know, but we don't learn anything.
Yeah.
And that's one of the great failings, I think, of human beings, that we're completely oblivious to these things. We just carry on our lives as normal because we don't want to have to think about it.
Yeah.
And I'm as guilty of that as anybody.
Well, we're all guilty of it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. God, well, there you go. So how do you find... I mean, we've talked about this a lot. I was going to ask you how you think the film sort of holds up in 2025. Scarily well, by the sounds of it.
Horrifically well. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because of the found footage. We don't focus on things like costumes, clothing and hairstyles and stuff like that. And so it hasn't dated at all.
No.
As I'm sure I've rambled about on this pod before, that oh my God, pods. I'm on a pod, like an isopod. Oh my God,
we're on a isopodcast. Yeah,
isopodcast. Oh, that's what we should rename this episode.
Yes.
The isopodcast. Absolutely brilliant. It's just. I've often argued this thing that nothing's changed since 2000 anyway. That culture and everything's the same, but this film does feel incredibly current. Like I say, watching it last night, my first thought, and I hadn't connected with it before because I hadn't seen it for a couple of years, was the pollution in the water in Britain.
Yeah.
So that was my immediate thought. It's like, oh, hang on a minute. They've got sort of runoff silage and sewage from chicken plants going into the water. We've got God knows what sewage going into the sea and into the rivers in this country. So, I mean, it stands up well because as I kept banging on, we don't learn anything. No. We don't change anything. And this is depressingly relevant, more so than ever. I would love this film. I'm sure Barry Levinson would agree with me. Love for this film to be completely irrelevant in 2025.
Yeah.
That it was just, it's just another horror film. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. It's a highly relevant horror film, and we should all be worried about that, I think.
Agreed. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I also think even the found footage, because I think found footage now can sometimes look a bit of its time. Even 10 years old found footage. It was such a thing at this point in time, wasn't it? Off the back of Paranormal Activity. And I think this one stands the test of time because it's got that documentary vibe, actually.
Because it's got the structure.
Yeah.
I think it's more akin to, this is Spinal Tap than it is to, Blair Witch
Lake
Project.
Mungo or something.
Lake Mungo is another superb example of this, where they've structured the footage and contextualised it.
Yeah.
And that was the original plan for Blair Witch Project, that they were going to have this footage presented and they were going to cut away to talking heads in studios. And that became, I think it's called Curse of the Blair Witch, which was like the fake documentary about the fake documentary, which was very clever. But, they originally planned to do that. And I think it's that all-important contextualising bit that makes the film work.
Agreed. And I think, you know, since these movies like Lake Mungo and The Bay as well, we've had this absolute boom of kind of Netflix documentaries, right? I think that's the other thing, is that it kind of feels quite like it feels very relevant right now, because we watch so many quote-unquote documentaries or true crime docs they're set out like this, basically, aren't they? You know,
I'm as guilty as the next man. I love a true crime documentary, and it's like, you know, I sit there watching it, hating myself for watching these things, but you can't help yourself. You know, you're kind of hooked on these things. So yeah, I mean, I think it is probably, you're right, that we're sort of so used now to documentaries being presented in a certain style. That The Bay, back in the day when it was released, it might have looked a little bit odd. Now it just looks like, put it on Netflix, everybody would just believe it.
Totally.
You know, nobody would question that this wasn't really happening.
You can watch one of those Netflix, Fire Festival documentaries and think you're watching some sort of horror film about the end of the world, to be honest. So,
God, yeah, I watched the one about Woodstock 96, was it?
Yeah.
And it's like Apocalypse Now, isn't it?
Exactly. So there you go. So that is The Bay from 2012.
Go and watch The Bay. If you've never seen it, please do yourself a massive favour. You will not be disappointed by watching that film.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, there you go. Well, before we move on to the next film, Kev, let's head on over to this week's Wild About Horror, the final Wild About Horror segment of this season, because, of course, Freudian cinephile Mary Wild has plenty of thoughts on Barry Levinson's The Bay.
Hey Mike, Mary Wild here, with some thoughts on Barry Levinson's The Bay, a mockumentary horror film exploring the devastating consequences of environmental collapse, focusing on the fictional town of Claridge, Maryland. Through a series of found footage vignettes, the film unveils the catastrophic outbreak in the Chesapeake Bay. While the story revolves around the grotesque and violent destruction of the human body, it also serves as a reflection of psychological collapse. The events in the film remind me of an encounter with the real, an uncontainable force that eludes meaning and understanding, destabilizing both the characters and the audience's relationship with reality. Jacques Lacan's concept of the real refers to an aspect of human experience that resists symbolization, language, and understanding. It is the realm of existence that lies beyond the grasp of the imaginary and symbolic orders, which are responsible for the structures of meaning and identity. The real is not simply reality as we know it. It is the inescapable, often traumatic kernel of experience that disrupts our sense of self and order. In The Bay, the environmental disaster and mutated isopods it spawns serves as an encounter with the real. The horror of the film is not only in the physical disintegration of bodies, but also in the realization that the town's destruction cannot be comprehended or symbolized within the existing framework of human understanding. The isopod's rapid mutation and violent consumption of human bodies challenge the characters' ability to make sense of the world around them. They face a natural force that defies their ability to conceptualize or control it. This overwhelming presence, unseen, invasive, and ultimately unknowable, embodies Lacan's notion of the real. The inhabitants of Claridge cannot integrate this event into their perception of the world because it cannot be understood or properly represented. The disaster itself is an affront to the very structure of meaning and the symbolic order that sustains the characters' lives. The film shows environmental collapse as a trauma, a rupture. As the residents of Claridge fall victim to the isopod infestation, Their lives descend into chaos, and they are unable to fit the situation into a coherent narrative. This breakdown in the ability to interpret or control their environment mirrors the Lacanian experience of confronting the real. The real is a force that undermines and shatters the symbolic world, as evidenced by the escalating horror in the film. The protagonists, such as the reporter Donna, struggle to maintain their sense of agency and control as the calamity unfolds. The more they attempt to impose meaning on the situation by recording, documenting, and analyzing the outbreak, the more they are confronted by the irreducible nature of the catastrophe. In Lacanian terms, the town of Claridge and the entire Chesapeake Bay area is a site of symbolic failure where the character's attempts to bring the event into language are futile. The water and the contamination within it depict the real, a domain of experience that disrupts the linguistic sphere. The film's mockumentary style, relying on fragmented found footage and often unreliable accounts from characters, emphasizes the impossibility of making sense of the horror they face. The various characters, from doctors to officials, attempt to control or rationalize the event, but their efforts are in vain. The real of nature, symbolized by the mutated isopods, the lethal water, and the environmental degradation, cannot be reconciled with the victim's understanding of the world. The isopods in the bay are creatures that infiltrate the human body in an unstoppable way, mirroring the corruption and invasion of the self by something that cannot be understood or controlled. This evokes Lacan's idea of the body as a site of alienation. The isopods eat their hosts from the inside out, halting the body's natural disposition to protect and preserve itself. The lesions and grotesque transformations represent the real invading the physical form. The isopods destroy the body, displacing its natural integrity and exposing the fragility of human existence. This corruption of the body reflects Lacan's notion of the unrecognizable. The body is no longer a coherent whole, but an unmanageable, unfamiliar thing. As the characters witness this invasion, they are forced to confront the impossibility of integration. Humans become an uncanny sight, inhabited by the foreign and the monstrous. The isopods now manifest as an internalized event, doubling down on the trauma of the real, an imposition of disorder upon the body that cannot be symbolized or fully comprehended. In the Bay, we see the government suppressing the truth, obscuring the nature of the disaster, and shutting down attempts to document the events. Authorities create a false narrative and halt the spread of information, manipulating the linguistic domain pertaining to the catastrophe. This refusal to expose the cause of the disaster is an attempt to downplay the force of the real. Instead of being upfront about what's really going on, the powers that be try to frame it as something manageable. Governmental denial acts as a defense mechanism against the intrusion of the real. Dismissing the disaster as the result of unusually high water temperatures speaks to a Lacanian defense of the symbolic order. It is easier for society to refute the terrifying reality of the mutated isopods and instead focus on a rational explanation that reasserts control over the situation. Trying to soften the nature of the crisis underscores Lacan's assertion that the real escapes every attempt at categorization. The characters' attempts to understand and manage the disaster are futile, as the event resists interpretation and renders their symbolic structures inadequate. The breakdown of the human body and the governmental cover-up further highlight the fragility of the symbolic order when confronted with the eruptive force of the real. The film serves as a reflection on the traumatic encounter with nature's overwhelming power. It forces both the characters and the audience to face the limits of human understanding and the inability to fully contain or control environmental forces. In Lacanian terms, the Bay illustrates the profound anxiety and terror that arise when the boundaries of the symbolic order are breached. The isopod catastrophe becomes a metaphor for the encounter with the unknown and the unknowable, revealing the human vulnerability to a natural world that exists beyond our comprehension and control. That concludes my final contribution to the Nature Bites Back season of Evolution of Horror podcast. Thanks as always for having me. Until next time.
Oh, as ever, a massive thank you to Mary Wilde for this week's contribution and all of her incredible contributions throughout our Nature Bites Back season. She'll be back on our conclusion episode for a little wrap-up chat with me in a couple of weeks' time. But until then, don't forget you can find more of Mary's work on her Patreon, patreon.com/MaryWilde.
I just wanted to come here.
To Winkies?
This Winkies.
Why this Winkies?
It's kind of embarrassing. I had a dream about this place.
Oh boy.
You see what I mean?
So you had a dream about this place?
Well, it's the second one I've had. But they're both the same. They start out that I'm in here, but there's a man in back of this place. He's the one who's doing it. I can see him through the wall. I can see his face. I hope that I never see that face ever outside of a dream.
As I'm sure all of you are aware by this point, last week we lost the great filmmaker, my favourite filmmaker, David Lynch. Now, earlier on this week, I dropped a bonus episode where Steph McKenna and I talked about the life and the career of David Lynch, and I wanted to let people in the UK know that in memory of this artistic genius, we are going to be screening a load of David Lynch films around the UK. Now, we are yet to announce some of our very special events. If you want to be kept abreast of what live events we're going to be announcing around the UK over the next few weeks, the best thing to do is to sign up to our newsletter, evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter, to be the first to know. But we have announced already that we are going to be screening arguably David Lynch's masterpiece, Mulholland Drive, on the 12th of February at the beautiful Regent Street Cinema in London. Honestly, one of the most beautiful films ever made, screened in one of the most beautiful cinemas in the country. I absolutely cannot wait. That film is such a mood. It's so beautiful, it's so moving, and of course it also contains at least two of the scariest moments in cinema history as well. So if you haven't seen it, or even if you have seen it, come and join us for this very special screening. It's going to be followed by a live panel discussion on stage with special guests where we try and unpick Mulholland Drive in depth. Just head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events, and if you can't make that particular event, like I said, please sign up to our newsletter because we have more David Lynch screenings and events around the UK to announce very, very soon. Sign up to our newsletter, evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode in which Kevin Lyons and I discuss Evolution from 2015.
J'ai vu un mort. Dans la mer. Il avait une étoile sous le ventre. Une étoile de mer? Dans la mer, on croit voir beaucoup de choses. Pourquoi je suis malade? Parce que ton corps se transforme.
It's not to be confused with the 2001 comedy film,
No.
which when you asked me if I'd do this, that's what I thought, why is he doing that film?
Yeah.
That's not really, that's an alien event. What's that? And then sort of, oh no, hang on, it's a later
There's
one.
another one.
Yeah, this is the one which, like The Bay, is set in a coastal community, albeit here a much smaller and more isolated one.
Yeah.
It's an island, in fact, and it's about a rather fragile young boy named Nicholas, really nicely played by Max Brabant.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very good performance. He lives near the sea with his mother in a community made up of these. Well, it's made up entirely of women and young boys, which in itself is unusual. There are no men around.
Yeah.
And no young girls. And no one comments on this at the start of the film. In fact, no one comments on it at all, but it becomes clear why that's the situation as we go along. Poor Nicholas ends up being the subject of strange experiments being carried out by a mysterious group of women living on this island. They may not be entirely human, in fact.
Yeah.
And he ends up in hospital with some other boys who all got like incision marks in their stomachs. And it turns out that the boys are all carrying or have been carrying fetuses.
Yeah.
And the rest you should probably watch for yourself, to be honest, because I don't want to give too much away about it. But it's incredibly odd film.
Very odd.
Very strange film. Odd in the best possible way. My kind of odd.
I know. I
Yeah.
thought this would be up your street, this movie, because it is it's not a movie that kind of spells out much. It's very ambiguous, and it's very much a mood rather than a story in a way, right?
It is. I've seen people complain that, there's not much story, or I didn't get the story. No, you didn't get the film.
Yes.
The story is not necessarily... I mean, the story's interesting, and we can theorise about what it all means, and probably will as we go along. But it's not the important thing, I don't think. I think the important thing is the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And the ambience of it, and this sort of weird, dreamlike atmosphere that the director, and apologies to Lucille, I may well get your surname wrong, but Lucille Hadzihalilovic?
Yeah, Hadzihalilovic. It's apologies in advance, we're going to massacre this name.
No, forgive me, Lucille, I'm going to refer to you by your first name because I'm terribly English and I can't do foreign words and all the rest of it, and I don't want to upset you, so I'm going to use your first name. I do apologise. And she, of course, is the wife of filmmaking partner of Gaspar Noé, who's very familiar around these parts. And I think she had some things to say.
Yeah.
I think there are points she wanted to make.
Yeah.
But I think the atmosphere is what counts here.
Yeah.
I think that's what's important.
I agree. I think what's really interesting about this film is that on the one hand, there is a kind of an ickiness, for want of a better word. There is a body horror element to it, and there's a bit of squirminess about it, like The Bay. But it's also really kind of basking in the beauty of nature, this film, right? I think there's also something just very beautiful about what it's presenting us, you know?
It's a gorgeous film.
Yeah.
Even when it's in these horrible, dank, run-down exteriors, there's a kind of horrible beauty to those scenes. It starts out, in fact, when you first watch it, you're completely sort of put off by the fact that it starts like a high-end nature documentary.
It does.
With this gorgeous underwater photography of these underwater plants all sort of billowing in the sort of the stream of water. And and it goes on like that. You get these amazing shots of the island and of the sunsets and the island, the sea around the island by moonlight. And it does look like a nature documentary. Unfortunately, the nature it's dealing with is, pretty unpleasant, to be honest.
Agreed. And I think that's interesting too, because it's almost the opposite message, I think, to The Bay, because The Bay is very much like, look at what we're doing to our planet. Look at how much we're ruining things. This is bad. Whereas this movie is kind of like, nature does what it does, and we've got to let nature do what it does, essentially, right? I mean, it's called evolution. So it's much more about like, okay, even if, horrific things happen, this is just the natural world, and there's a beauty in that too, almost.
We may not like it, what nature does.
Yeah.
Hippie hat on. It's no worse than what we do to nature. Yeah. To be perfectly honest, I think it's far more benign. You know, nature is what nature is. Nature, again, like, you know, the isopods, it doesn't care about us.
Right.
You know, I know we have this sort of, I love nature and all the rest of it. Nature doesn't care about you.
No.
You know, sort of nature, it allows you to go out there and do things until you start messing with it.
Yeah.
But, you know, so if we can learn to just live with it, then nature doesn't care about us, and that's fine. That's how it probably should be.
Yeah.
But, you know, as we pointed out, we don't just go out there and behave ourselves, and nature gets very upset with us. And I think, and what's interesting is this film sort of, it's kind of a nexus between lots of different subgenres. So we've got the Nature Bites Back, we've got body horror, we've got mad science.
Yeah, we do actually.
You know,
yeah, we do.
Yeah, we've got possibly alien invasion. We don't know who these women are. You know, it's all very Lovecraftian.
Very Lovecraftian, yes.
I mean, you know, Lovecraft liked his little isolated villages by the sea.
Yeah.
That's what we have here. You could imagine, you know, if David Cronenberg ever had a brainstorm thought, I'm going to remake Splash, it might look like this.
That's right. That's right. It's Splash as a body horror, basically. Isn't it?
It's body horror mermaids in effect. You know, I think I can sort of detect sort of influences perhaps from Dagon, the Stuart Gordon Lovecraft adaptation, from the Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead film Spring,
definitely,
which is itself very Lovecraftian.
Yeah,
I think, you know, if you're listening, people who program, you know, sort of smaller theatres, a good double bill would be this and Under the Skin.
Oh wow, yeah,
which I think covers a lot of very similar territory, certainly the very similar ambience.
Yes.
And I think, it's very. I mean, it's an overworked term, but it's so apt for this. It's dreamlike.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and you can't make sense of dreams.
No.
And I wonder if perhaps. Certainly I've struggled a bit too hard to make sense of evolution. I wonder if perhaps maybe that in itself is the joke. We don't understand evolution.
I think that's right.
So how can we understand the film called Evolution?
I think, I think you're absolutely right about that. I think it links into that Lovecraftian element, right? Where this is something bigger than we can comprehend almost.
Absolutely.
And I think you get that feeling. And it's funny. I mean, you mentioned Gaspar. I mean, it is funny that she's married to Gaspar Noé, this director, and she produced a lot of his early movies.
Indeed.
Well.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a way, I feel like you couldn't get more different to Gaspar Noé as well, right? You know, like his movies, the camera work, the strobing, the violence, it feels like it's an attack, right, when you watch a Gaspar Noé film. Whereas this is like the pacing, the cinematography, the way it's framed and shot and directed, it couldn't be more different, could it, in a way? You know?
Well, I'm going to disappoint a huge number of your listeners by admitting I'm not that familiar with Gaspar Noé's work, and I don't know why that is.
Well,
you know, I've seen Irreversible, I've seen Climax, I think that's probably all I've seen. So I've seen, you know...
I think if you've seen those two, you get the gist.
I get the flavour of what he's doing. And yes, you're right, it is an assault on the senses. Very deliberately so. You know, he's very experimental with his camera work and his editing and so on. Whereas I think Lucille, sorry, it sounds horrible to use your first name, disrespectful, but I'm going to have to use it. Lucille has a very different approach.
Yeah,
it's kind of the difference between Gaspar Noé is the filmmaking equivalent of industrial music,
right?
You know, he's Ministry or whatever, and she's Brian Eno. She's very much more ambient, very much more sort of a creepy atmosphere rather than in your face, here we are. And both things work brilliantly.
Yeah.
Neither one is better than the other. You may prefer one over the other, but both are legitimate ways of making a film. But yeah, it is very odd that her filmmaking style is so radically... Or is it odd?
Well...
I mean, why should she be like Gaspar Noé?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to spend this, you know, comparing her to her husband.
Oh, good God,
but
no.
I think the main thing that was interesting is that because she was also his producer, there was that kind of filmmaking connection there.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really interesting about it, is that it couldn't be more different.
But I wonder if it's more accurate, really, to sort of compare her to herself.
Yeah.
Because, you know, her earlier films, you got things like Innocence and Earwig,
right?
Which are all films about the trials and tribulations of childhood.
Yeah.
how difficult childhood can be sometimes. And this is almost the extreme of that.
Absolutely.
You know, this is about a very damaged, very tortured childhood. So I think, you know, she has her own way of doing things.
Yeah.
And quite right.
And you're right, you know, that so much about this film and her other films also are about kind of adolescence as well, right?
Yeah.
And this movie has, again, you could almost look at it as a kind of puberty movie, right, for these boys.
It is. Yeah, absolutely, because he's 11, I think, Nicholas.
Yes.
So, yeah, he's coming up on puberty. Some, you know, kids go through it quite early.
Exactly. And there's all kinds of body horror involved in that stage of your life, you know.
Even at 62, I can remember the horrors of puberty when suddenly something stopped working and something started working. It was like, I don't want any of this. This is horrible. And, you know, puberty is a very difficult time, I think. And not as difficult as this, you know, having fetuses implanted in you. Right. But I think it buys into that. It buys into that, our shared memories.
Yeah.
You know, boys and girls go through puberty in different ways, but they're both traumatic and difficult, and, you know, it can be quite psychologically stressful.
Yes, exactly.
And I think what this is doing is saying, do you remember that time? Look at this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually the movie does quite a good job of, even though there's a slight distance really in this movie, like we said, it's quite ambiguous, it's quite dreamlike in a way that could disconnect us from these characters, but I think there's quite an emotional centre of this, isn't there?
Definitely.
This little boy Nicholas and his relationship with his mother, and then some of these other women on the island. There is a real there's a real emotional centre to this movie. There's quite a sadness to it almost, isn't there?
There is, because you know, Nicholas comes to learn the lesson that a lot of us have to learn in life, that adults aren't to be trusted. Mm-hmm. You know, I had a great upbringing. My mum and dad were brilliant, but of course they were never quite as brilliant as I thought they were when I was 6.
Right.
Because they were human and they were fallible. And that's, you know, this is what's going on here, I think. He's learning that adults in general are probably not to be trusted.
Yeah.
He learns that this person that he thought was his mother probably isn't.
Yeah.
There's a hint, isn't there, in the bit where he befriends a nurse, Stella, one of the sort of alien, mermaid, whatever they are, nurses, who sort of takes pity on him, and she brings him some crayons to do drawings.
That's right.
And he draws things like skyscrapers and planes and things he couldn't possibly have seen.
Right.
Which hints that he's not from the island, that he was abducted and brought to the island.
That's right.
And, you know, so of course all these adults around him, and they're all women. I don't know what that means. I'm probably not qualified to comment on that, but they are all women. They all let him down.
Yeah.
One way or another. They've all been lying to him.
Yes.
And, you know, it's heartbreaking.
It is.
It is, really. And at the beginning, you know, even the boys who are like him, they're in the same boat as him, bully him.
Right, yeah.
Because he's different even to in fact, they bully him. I thought this was quite interesting what we're talking about here. They bully him with a rather large crustacean that they found.
Yes.
And it looks like, you know, the next stage of the isopods from the bay.
It does. It really does. It's horrible, isn't it? And you're right. You know, actually, there were elements of that reminded me a bit of Let the Right One In, you know? That lonely little boy. And the fact that we're sort of seeing this whole movie, this whole world through his eyes, which I think is why everything is so unclear, right? Like, we don't quite know what's going on in the way that he doesn't, and he's piecing together what's happening.
Unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
I mean, how more unreliable do you need to be than a traumatised 11-year-old boy?
Right, exactly.
You know, having worked in social services for many years, I can tell you that children will tell you what you want to hear. Whatever they think you want to hear, they'll tell you.
Yeah.
And, you know, so this is him recounting this story in some way. Mm-hmm. Not understanding it. How can he possibly understand it? So he can't help us to understand it because he doesn't know what's going on.
No. Exactly.
And in that sense, it is a perfect encapsulation of what it's like to be a child in a very scary situation.
I agree.
You know? And so, yeah, I mean, this makes this nice little trilogy with Innocence, Earwig and this of different ways that children have to come to terms with the fact that they're growing up and the world isn't quite what they thought it was, which is terribly sad.
It is.
You know, if you watch other people's children, your own children, whatever, reach that point, and you see that childlike innocence start to fade away when they realise that the world's actually quite quite difficult to be in. You know, it's terribly sad. And there's a sadness that comes right through this film from the very start.
Definitely.
Right from the beginning.
Definitely. And, you know, you mentioned the kind of the crustaceans and stuff. There is also this link, obviously. This is before we find out that these women may be mermaids. There is this link between the humans and these sea creatures, right? I think there's this interesting starfish kind of parallel throughout, isn't there, as well? Which is kind of interesting.
We first meet Nicholas underwater, which I think is quite a pertinent, point anyway. We first meet him underwater, and he finds a body on the bottom of the sea with a starfish attached to its stomach.
Yeah.
Now, of course, given what we're going to find out later about stomachs and all the rest of it, that sort of, resonates throughout the film anyway. But yeah, he sort of rescues this starfish, which once upon a time, many years ago, I wanted to be a marine biologist.
Right, yeah.
Having seen these films, I will never go near the sea again. But I didn't become a marine biologist because I'm actually quite scared of water. So it was a bit,
wouldn't be the ideal career.
No, it's a bit like astronauts who can't take heights. It's like no, it's never going to work for anybody. But if I remember my basic sort of marine biology, I think starfish reproduce asexually, or some species do.
So this is very interesting. They start off male, and then as they age, they turn female.
That's right. Yeah, and that's possibly what we're seeing here.
Yes.
These boys may be destined at some point to become female.
Yeah.
Because they may be part of, maybe whatever is inside them has now turned them into whatever these creatures are.
Exactly.
And, the nurses, as we see them, they're fairly asexual looking anyway.
Yeah.
They're very gaunt, very pale. They've got no discernible eyebrows.
Right.
They don't look human. They don't look like sexual creatures.
No. Maybe the only moment is when they're all naked on the beach.
That's
and that
right,
kind of,
yeah.
That almost looks more like we're dealing with some sort of witchy occult movie.
It's more of a ritual, I think, than actually a sexual act, I think, that one. I think that's just something that possibly, even by their nature, they don't know why they're doing it.
Right.
It's that time of month we're going to go down onto the beach. Maybe it is a sort of, time of the month parallel. We go down to the beach and, with our lanterns and a procession down to the beach.
Yeah.
And then we do this weird writhing together thing.
Yeah.
And, when I was watching it didn't strike me as being a particularly sexual act.
No.
It just struck me as being this kind of thing that they did. It was like a connection thing more than a sexual thing.
Well, they were sort of passing something around, and I was trying to work out if that was a fetus, maybe, or something, but I couldn't work out what it was. Yeah.
Very difficult to make out what it was, and I like that.
Yes.
I like that. I like the fact that we can come onto a podcast and we can say to each other, what was that?
Yeah.
And,
exactly.
if we were in a pub, we just get very drunk and argue about it for a couple of hours about what we thought it was.
That's basically what I've made a career out of, is taking pub conversations that I would have and making them into podcasts, really.
Oh, if I'd known that, I've got a few ciders in.
Yeah.
A bit with a line on the beach.
Yeah.
But I think it was intentional.
Yes.
That she did it that way, that we couldn't see what it was, that we don't know what they're doing.
And I think there's something, like you said, I think it's no coincidence that, we talked about the starfish and the fact that this movie only has the only children are male and the only adults we see are female, right? And there's no crossover, and I think that is clearly very deliberate. Like, something is at play here in terms of genders and bodies.
Exactly, yeah. And like I say, possibly the boys turn into women as they age.
Yes.
Not through anything. They're not born, they're not descended from these creatures, because they don't seem to reproduce sexually. They reproduce asexually by implanting, something. Their eggs, I don't know, inside boy bodies. Right. And we think possibly that Nicholas and maybe some of the others were abducted from the mainland.
We know something's up from the first act, even when the mother is preparing food for her little boy, and it's like it's worms or something, isn't it? And
that's right.
Okay, there's something odd going on here from the beginning.
Strange. Right from the start, she doesn't feel like a mother that we would expect to see in a film. She's very distant. It's almost like she doesn't know how to be a mother.
Yes, exactly.
There's no, I don't want to get into the whole sort of nature versus nurture debate and all the rest of it, but I think, I've known enough pregnant women and women who've given birth, and they are automatically very protective of the child. They carry this child inside them for 9 months. Of course they're bloody protective.
Yeah.
These women apart from Stella, seem to have no interest in the boys whatsoever.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it, with Stella, why she is... she seems to have this kind of sympathy for this little boy, doesn't she?
Yeah.
She's kind of connecting with him more than the other women. Yeah.
And I don't know whether it means anything, but she seems to have eyebrows where the other women don't. Now, I know it's a strange observation,
that's a
but
really
she's
good observation.
not like the others.
Again, I kind of feel like that must be deliberate, right? That must be deliberate.
I think she's far too clever a filmmaker not to be deliberate. You know, it's very obvious that she's doing something. There's a mission behind this. We may not see it. We may never see it. We may never understand it, but that's not the point.
No. And I think there is this, of course, element of body horror to this movie as well. And
an element of it. I mean,
I know. I mean, honestly, this is the thing. You know, we've talked about this kind of beauty and this kind of this emotion. But also, it's pretty fucking creepy and weird and icky, this movie, isn't it? And these women with these kind of like suckers on their back. Yeah. And again, impregnating the boys and like all of this stuff is horrible.
And they spend their evenings watching videos of cesarean sections, and we get to see that. And I don't think I needed to see it, to be honest.
No.
It's like, it is like, again, about the fallibility of bodies, that this is a species of something or other which doesn't seem to be able to reproduce sexually.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
They've got to become parasites to continue their species. And that in itself is interesting. It's also very interesting, I think, that, you know, in the past, when we've had a mad science film, it's usually a male scientist experimenting on women.
Yeah, yeah.
This is the exact opposite of that. And it kind of confronts us a little bit, I think, because we don't want to think of women as behaving like that.
Yeah, I love that. And so what do we think ultimately is going on here? They're kidnapping kids from cities. These women are like, let's say mermaids, for want of a better word, right?
Let's call them mermaids,
these kind of weird kind of sea creatures.
Yeah.
And they are using children to reproduce. Is that what we're assuming is the case?
That's what I'm assuming it is. Yeah. I can't think of any other, unless they're eating the babies, which would be just too horrific for words.
Yeah.
And there's no indication that they're doing that, of course.
Right.
You know, there's a scene, quite a startling scene, where Nicholas wakes up floating in a tank and there are two tiny babies floating in the tank with him.
It's horrible.
And the implication being that they've been taken out of him.
Yes.
You know, and so maybe these babies are all female.
Yeah, right.
And maybe the boys are not actually important, other than just being
vessels,
you know, receptacles, for whatever it is they put into them.
We're back to xenomorphs again, aren't we, basically?
We're back to xenomorphs again, exactly. And so it has this sort of really sort of interesting take on, you know, sort of reproductive cycles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, there's been an old joke, isn't there, that if men could give birth to children, we'd figure out how to make it a lot less painful very, very quickly.
Yes.
And I think it's playing into that, you know, that like men don't have children, but what if you did?
Yeah.
You know, what if you did? This is what it would be like for you.
Well, absolutely. And again, to go back to Alien, you know, like, of course, countless people have written all about this, about how it taps into that fear of male rape, of male birth, and all of that kind of thing, right? And it is, you know, for us men, it is one of the biggest fears, right? This idea of being impregnated. It's so funny,
I have a young family member at the moment who is pregnant, and I'm delighted because I'm going to be an Uncle Kev again. Yay, great. But there's a part of me that thinks, how do you do that? How do you have a living thing inside you? And it's a male thing.
I think that's it. And so for all of its kind of beauty and subtlety, this movie, there's something genuinely nightmarish and taboo about not just impregnating a male, but a child as well, right? You know?
Child, yes, horrible. Exactly. Yeah, this is verging on some very, very dodgy territory.
Yeah.
You know, and luckily she's too canny a film director to let it go too far, and she holds it in, and it doesn't become exploitative.
No,
in any way.
It's all just implied, isn't it? It's all just implied as he's piecing it together. Yeah.
Yes, and what he does do, I think, is it takes the beauty of birth, because, you know, for all our sort of, you know, physical revulsion at the idea of something carrying around inside you, birth is an incredible thing.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that this can happen and continue the species, it takes it and completely corrupts it.
Yeah.
You know, it completely turns it on its head. I wonder, in fact, I'm fairly certain I know that it couldn't have been made by a male director.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah.
I think this had to be a woman's point of view. And, it's it's fascinating. And it's one of those films, I've seen it twice now. When you asked me to do this, like I say, I hadn't seen it. I've seen it twice since, once just before I came into here, just to try and get my head around it. I have a feeling it's one of those films that I'm going to have to watch 3, 4, 5 times.
Yeah, I agree.
And even then, I may never get it.
There are certain things that happen in the final act that confuse me a bit. Like, I don't really understand Stella, what she's doing to Nicholas. There's a moment when she basically drowns him. She kills him. Then she brings him back with CPR.
Brings him back to life.
It's almost like she's testing him or something. I don't know.
That's right.
Because then later there's a moment when they go into the water together and she's pressing her mouth
breathing
to
life
his and giving him air, basically.
It's a very unsettling moment because basically you've got a grown woman kissing a little boy, and it's
reminds me of the end of The Innocents, which I think is one of the creepiest images in
moments
cinema.
ever. Absolutely, and it's very like that.
Yeah.
It is entirely innocent in the sense that it's not a sexual act, but because we're sexual creatures, we're primed to think that.
Yeah.
But I think Stella, my reading of it is that Stella has begun to question what they're doing. And this is imposing a very prosaic understanding on a film that's far more abstract and interesting than my sort of ideas are going to be. But I think she's having second thoughts about what the women are doing.
Yeah.
She decides to free Nicholas because she's bonded with him. I think she drowns him to kill whatever might be in him.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Because it then can't survive.
Yeah.
And then she lets him go. Because if she'd let him go, I mean, even in the way it is at the end, he's still carrying something.
Right. I know. Because
so when
of course it ends
with
with him floating on a boat towards a city, right?
Towards a
going
city,
home, essentially. Yeah.
So is he now exporting? Are the women now exporting themselves into our world?
Right.
You know? And you're right, it's not clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm absolutely delighted that it's not clear.
Absolutely.
If someone had popped up and given us a 10-minute lecture on what was going on, I would have been so disappointed.
Exactly.
You know, and I want to work it out for myself.
And I think, you know, in this way, this is where it feels different to a movie that is more sci-fi like The Bay. This is, you know, you don't quite know whether you're dealing with sci-fi or just nature, quote unquote,
it's
right?
Fantasy, isn't it? It's more fantasy than science fiction. There's no real scientific rationale for anything that goes on.
No.
It's just this kind of world next door sort of thing.
Yeah.
They slip through this portal into this world where these women exist, these creatures exist, and we don't know where they come from. It doesn't matter. We don't know what they're up to. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's just the fact that they're there doing things that gives the film that very creepy, very atmospheric edge.
Oh, it's you know, it is. It's a movie that I saw back in the day at the cinema in 2015, and it's 10 years old now, and it really has stayed with me. I think it's one of those movies that, again, it's subtle, it's quiet, it's weird, but it does get under your skin and it does stay with you. You know, it's got some interesting ideas.
I saw it for the first time about a week ago when I got your message. Can you do that? Yeah, okay, fine. I went and watched it, and for days afterwards, I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
And it's so rare. You know, I mean, I'm an idiot and I consume films far too many probably for a very sensible person. And a lot of them just go straight over my head. And a lot of them are probably designed to go straight over your head. But occasionally you'll find a film like this which hits you in a very special way. And you just think, I need to go back to that. I need to go and see it again.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, like I said before, my favourite film is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I've seen it literally hundreds of times, and I still don't really know what's going on.
Yeah.
And, you know, every time I see it, something new is revealed. I've got a feeling that evolution will be like that.
Yeah.
That every time I watch it, a new layer will become evident.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's got that it has got a similar vibe and mood to 2001.
It has,
in a way. There's a kind of beauty, but there's a menace and dread, and there's an ambiguity.
2001.
Yeah.
If nothing else, is about evolution.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
You know, we had that weird little sort of thing, didn't we, in the late 60s, all coming out together, Planet of the Apes and 2001, and The Naked Ape was the bestseller and all the rest of it. Suddenly evolution was a big deal. And it's become less of a big deal over time, I think, but then that allows the space for people like Lucille to come along and say, all right, let's play with it.
Yes.
Let's do something different with it now.
Yeah.
They've done the big picture. Aliens come down and boost us up the evolutionary ladder. They've done all that. And I think I'm right in saying that when she did, she replied to the Sight and Sound poll, Best Film poll, that 2001 was one of her favourite films.
Yeah.
As indeed was The Spirit of the Beehive. and Grave of the Fireflies.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Both films about children undergoing very traumatic childhoods.
Yeah, there you go. That makes sense.
None of this happens by mistake.
Yeah.
You know, every filmmaker is a product of their influences, and some people have got better influences than others.
Yeah, completely. And that's it. I would urge everyone to give it a watch. It's not a riotous monster movie the way that The Bay might be, but it is tackling similar things in a really kind of similarly icky way at times. You know,
you may not like the film when you've watched it, but you'll certainly feel something.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's one of those films. It's not a film that will wash over you and you think, oh, well, that was watched, ticked off the box, hit the box on that one, I'll move on to the next one now to watch. You'd either sort of make you think very deeply about things that you've probably never thought about before, like he did with me.
Yes.
Or you'll just hate it unconditionally. And that doesn't matter in a way. You feel something. Films should make you feel something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And 90% of them don't. And so when you do find something like this, you know.
Both movies just make me want to stay away from the seaside, Kev, and stay away from crustaceans.
Most of them make me never want to leave my flat again, to be perfectly honest. Exactly. I'm a little bit worried about running a bath later, to be perfectly honest with you.
Checking my skin for boils and sores and, suckers and everything else, So,
wait till you get to my age and things do start sort of like erupting and falling off and all the rest of it. Oh my God, Oh
my God. Well, there we go. Well, Kev, thank you. What a joy.
Always a pleasure.
It's been so lovely to have you here. You'll be back again next series, of course. But until then, just let people know where can they find you? Where can they find more of your work?
I am on social media as usually as EOFF-TV, which is my website, EOFFTV.com. Still in the process of reconstruction. I said that 6 months ago. I possibly said that a year ago when we spoke as well, but it's still in the process of reconstruction. You can find EOFF TV Review, all one word, which is my mostly daily reviews. I've slipped a couple of days at the minute, but I'll get back to that on the weekend.
We'll get
there. I might do Evolution maybe, because there you go. Now it's in my mind. And I'm on a lot of social media. I may be skipping at least one of them in the near future, maybe two of them in the near future.
Yes.
But come and find, if you're on Blue Sky in particular, come and find me on Blue Sky. It's much nicer over there than anywhere else. But I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, but who knows for how much longer.
Exactly. Amazing. Kev, thank you so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Kevin Lyons. Always such a treat to have Kev on the podcast. And of course, he'll be back for part 1 of our 11th season of the podcast. And if you are a patron, by the way, you will know what subgenre we're covering in our next season, because that was announced earlier this week on Patreon. So if you want to find out what subgenre we're covering next, head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror and get yourself subscribed. But in the meantime, let us know what you thought of this week's episode. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, of course, Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, and I am on Blue Sky at Mike Muncer. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on your podcast app of choice, as that always helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. And, this week we discussed 2 really interesting artistic movies with something to say, Next week, not so much. Next week, it's time to dive into some trash, because, of course, this subgenre is maybe one of the most infamous when it comes to kind of trashy B-movies, right? Nature Bites Back and Animal Attack movies. The trashy ones are a dime a dozen, so we thought it's time to have a bit of fun. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Matt Draper, and we are going to be discussing... Sharknado from 2013 and Zombievers from 2014. It's going to be puntastic. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.